Did you know people are still making Wii U games? Darksiders Warmastered Edition, which is a terrible pun, released on Wii U earlier this week. Now, the game also released on Xbox One and PS4 last year, and of course, it's a re-release of the original Darksiders that released on 360 and PS3 back in 2009. Now, the Wii U is no stranger to the Darksiders series. The system actually launched with Darksiders 2, which means that if you organize your Wii U games chronologically, you could very well begin and end your collection with Darksiders games in the wrong order. Now, beyond being a big fan of the Darksiders series, there was another reason that I was kind of interested to check out this game on Wii U. You see, in the past, whenever the Wii U had a multi-platform release, say Assassin's Creed or Call of Duty or something like that, they would always use either the 360 or PS3 version to port to the Wii U. It never got the Xbox One or the PS4 version, obviously just because the Wii U wasn't as powerful. Makes sense, right? The thing is that Darksiders Warmastered Edition never actually released on the 360 or PS3. So my question was, is the Wii U actually running an Xbox One and PS4 game, or is this remastered actually just a port of the original 360 and PS3 version? So I decided to get the 360, the Wii U, and the Xbox One version all together to try to figure out exactly what this weird Wii U version is. Let's take a look. Now, just like its Xbox One and PS4 counterparts, the back of the box for the Wii U version claims that this Warmaster, has hellish HD resolution and 60 frames per second. Now, I'm not sure of the exact pixel count of hellish HD resolution, but I'm pretty sure I can spot 60 frames per second when I see it. And, unfortunately, this game features none of that. As far as I can tell from counting frames during the intro segment of the game, whether it be direct combat or when nothing's happening, or a cutscene, at no point does this game ever exceed 30 frames per second on Wii U. This is actually the same as the 360 and PS3 versions, which were also locked at 30 frames per second. The Xbox One and PS4 versions, on the other hand, both run at a pretty smooth 60 frames per second. Now, I will say that the 30 frames per second on the Wii U version is pretty consistent, and unlike the 360 and PS3 versions, it doesn't have that horrid frame tear issue. I mean, to be honest, the original version of Darksiders is one of the worst cases of frame tearing I've ever seen. 99% of the frames, and I'm not exaggerating, that's like an honest percentage. Pretty much every frame features frame tearing. Now, if you're not familiar with frame tearing, it's essentially when half of the frame renders in before the other half, and so during motion you kind of get one, like the bottom of the frame is ahead of the top part of the frame. It looks ugly. It looks terrible. It's an awful thing to do. The Wii U version, on the other hand, despite still running at 30 frames per second, doesn't have that issue. And it's probably the case that had they run it at 60 frames per second, they would have had some frame tearing. So I guess they probably decided better to run it at an almost locked 30 frames per second rather than have awful looking 60 frames per second, which I don't disagree with. That's a good way to handle weaker hardware when you're porting an Xbox One and PS4 game to a Wii U. The problem is that the back of the box says 60 frames per second. And as far as I can tell, this game at no point ever runs at 60 frames per second. It doesn't even look like it's an unlocked frame rate because it very accurately holds at 30 frames per second. It doesn't ever really look like it's trying to get higher. Like I said, even during cutscenes or anything like that, or when absolutely nothing is happening. Even when I stood in a room with no enemies, pretty small room, nothing happening, staying completely still, the game still ran at a very consistent 30 frames per second. I really don't think this game could ever run at 60 frames per second, so it really bothers me from an advertising standpoint that it says 60 frames per second on the back of the box. Now, as far as the hellish HD, sure, I guess. If there is an official pixel count for hellish HD, I'm not sure exactly what it is, but this game certainly does run at a resolution that is technically HD. As far as its moral position and its ranking in the celestial kingdoms, I'm not ready to make any official statements, heaven or hell, purgatory, wherever in that department. Now, I don't have any exact pixel counts, but from what I can tell just by looking at the game, I'm pretty sure that during gameplay it runs at about 720p. There doesn't appear to be any anti-aliasing, which means that there is a pretty jagged looking image. If you see like the edges of buildings at an angle, you'll get that stair-step pattern, which isn't great, but considering you're usually moving in this game, it didn't really bother me too much. What's interesting is that during cutscenes, it appears that the game jumps up to a full 1080, or at least something significantly higher than 720. You'll notice that a lot of those jaggies go away. It could also be that an aggressive anti-aliasing is being introduced, I'm not exactly sure, but it definitely looks a lot smoother during cutscenes. Now at first, I kind of wondered if maybe the cutscenes were pre-rendered, because obviously it seemed odd that the game would go up in resolution during cutscenes. But then when I looked at it, the game still runs at 30 frames per second in cutscenes, and you would think that if the cutscenes were rendered, assumingly using the Xbox One or PS4 version, they would be at 60 frames per second rather than 30. There's also occasionally weird frame hiccups, which lead me to believe these are being rendered in real time, but at a higher resolution than the regular game. So I will say, the cutscenes look pretty darn on par with the Xbox One and PS4 version, other than a lack of anti-aliasing, so that's actually pretty impressive. Now, as far as trying to figure out whether this game is actually the 8th generation version of Darksiders or the 7th generation of Darksiders, there are a few sort of contradicting pieces of information we can look at. First of all, the remastered, Warmastered version of Darksiders has an adjusted lighting model. I won't say improved, because there are definitely some areas where honestly I like the lighting better in the original version of the game, such as when you go to this big angel guy and you see the feathers, they're just lit badly in the new one. Regardless of what console you're playing it on, it looks a lot better in the original. But whatever, the point is that the Wii U definitely has the lighting setup of the Warmastered edition, which is a point for it being that version of the game. The Wii U version also seems to use the higher resolution texture assets that are present in the Warmastered edition. If you look at this room that I'm standing perfectly still in, this is actually right out of a cutscene, so I know that all the characters are located in essentially the same spot, so there's no sort of level of detail issues coming in from being standing in different places. You can tell on the walls that the Wii U version is using the assets from the Warmastered edition. There's a ton of detail that's just not there. There are also areas like this wall where there's just a different texture on it than was in the original, and that texture matches up with the Warmastered edition. So clearly, they are using assets from that enhanced version. So it's not just a straight port of the PS3 or 360 version or anything like that. And so initially I figured, okay, it's just the Warmastered edition running at a lower resolution, lower frame rate, and with no anti-aliasing. But still, the fact that it runs on Wii U is pretty impressive. But I did notice in a couple spots some things that made me wonder if maybe there was a little bit more of the original version than I initially thought. Now these could just be total coincidences, but I thought it was worth bringing up. Oftentimes when leaving a cutscene, there will be a single frame where War sort of repositions himself to get back into the actual gameplay from the cutscene. Now, all versions of the game do this. What's interesting is that the Xbox One version positions War differently than the Wii U and 360 version, which makes me wonder if maybe there's something left over from the old version that's still in the Wii U one that isn't in the Xbox One version. Now, it could just be that maybe the Xbox One is just weird. Maybe it was just some weird fluke a couple of times and nothing really to be drawn from it. But I also noticed a spot where after going through a zipline, the animation of War hitting the ground is actually different on the Wii U and 360 version than it is on the Xbox One version. In the Xbox One version, War jumps off the zipline and pretty much falls straight down. In the Wii U and 360 version, he flies out a lot farther and he lands in the exact same place on both of those versions. This makes me wonder if there's some leftover elements of code that are taken from the 360 version that aren't in the Xbox One version. It kind of makes me feel like maybe this is some sort of port of the old version with a few of the improvements from the new one, but not actually the entire new game. I don't know. It's a really weird example, and one that we haven't really seen before. In the past, whenever we've had a big multi-platform game that releases on Wii U, it's been pretty easy to see which version of the game the Wii U version was built from, be it 360 or PS3. This is sort of our first instance where we don't really have a direct 360 version to build from, and we can actually see how the Wii U stacks up to the Xbox One and PS4 running their games as opposed to running the 360 and PS3 games. Now granted, we still have some relic code from 360 and PS3 that might be in play in Darksiders, but it is interesting to see that it actually holds up pretty darn well against the Xbox One and PS4 versions. Now granted, Darksiders Warmastered is not a particularly demanding game, but still, it's a situation that we haven't really had a good chance to look at, and it's cool that we finally get a chance to at the very end of the Wii U's life, or, well, arguably, I guess, a little bit after it's already dead. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this kind of obscure video about an obscure game that released on a console we all thought was dead. If you haven't upgraded to the Switch yet, I strongly recommend checking out Darksiders if you haven't played it before. It's pretty much a very dark version of The Legend of Zelda with kind of like God of War combat. It's a really good game, you should play it. And the Wii U version is surprisingly solid, so check it out. But in the meantime, make sure to subscribe to Nintendo World Report TV and check out NintendoWorldReport.com for lots more. You can also check out our Patreon if you want to support what we do here by going to patreon.com/NWR. Thank you very much for watching. My name's John Raridan, and I will see you next time.